Good, now I have the full transcript. Let me write the new story applying all the patterns analyzed. Ten nan hand fanush in hukka. Me hump. O tu tran ho huntu na danzasha dun dianzaput dung. Dung Vivian mainhen funyisika. Arthur. B.O. O. Nien Mushu. O. Miyin. Mu. Mu. O. Me. Bull. Miles. Bull. Ni. Bru. Ni. My. I him. Ma. Henny. And ne. See me three. And third hum. Fon liem. Bang bang buh. Tu hum la yol. Tu an etzvongs thurhansum the. F. Bekoithuk. And yibita funk. Hetu hukos I fing tam the. Tu huet. Igia etuin. I still remember the exact moment the table went quiet. Igia. I still remember the exact moment the table went quiet. My fiancé's father had one hand wrapped around his glass of sweet tea, the other resting flat on the linen tablecloth, and he was explaining to me, slowly, clearly, the way people do when they're certain the person across from them doesn't quite follow, how the federal court system actually worked. Not the theory of it, he said, the reality, the part that law school didn't teach. I waited until he finished. Then I told him I was the federal judge assigned to his most recent case. But to understand how we arrived at that moment, you have to go back about 3 weeks. Maybe a little further than that, actually. I had been a federal district court judge for 11 years when Miles and I got engaged. Before that, I was an assistant U.S. attorney for 6 years. Before that, law school, a clerkship. 2 years at a firm I left because I realized I was built for a courtroom, not a conference room. I was 34 years old when I was first appointed to the bench. At the time, a few people said I was too young. I'd heard that before. I'd hear it again. Neither time made much difference to what I had to decide each morning when I walked into that courtroom. Miles was an architect. We met at a friend's dinner party in the city, the kind where someone always brings wine that's too nice for a Tuesday, and the conversation runs long past when people plan to leave. Miles had quiet confidence, not the kind that performs, but the kind that simply exists. He asked thoughtful questions. He remembered the answers. 3 years later, he asked me to marry him in the kitchen of his apartment on a Wednesday evening while we were cooking pasta, which was the least dramatic proposal in history and exactly right for the two of us. He knew what I did. He knew my title, my courtroom, the weight of what it meant. Outside of work, we rarely talked about it in detail. That was a choice I made early on in my career. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I'd learned that when you introduce yourself as a federal judge, it changes the texture of every conversation afterward. People become careful, or they become combative. Neither is relaxing at a dinner table. Miles understood that. He never pushed. Which is why it took me by surprise when, about 2 weeks after our engagement, he came home from visiting his parents in Connecticut with that particular look on his face. The one that means he's been thinking about something for 4 hours and hasn't figured out how to say it yet. We were sitting on the couch. He handed me a cup of coffee and then sat beside me and stared at the window for a moment too long. I said, "Whatever it is, just say it." He exhaled. "My father wants to meet you." "That's reasonable," I said. "Right." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There's just something you should know first." I waited. Miles rubbed the back of his neck. My dad was a litigator for 40 years. Federal courts, mostly. Civil rights cases, constitutional issues, the kind of work he still talks about at the table. "Sounds like an impressive career," I said. "It was. It is. He's proud of it." Miles paused. He's also very particular about how he sees the legal system, who belongs in certain rooms, how things should work. I set my coffee down. Particular how? Miles looked at me. He has opinions about judicial appointments, about how the process has become political, about whether the people being appointed today really have the depth of experience that the bench requires. I said nothing. He's not a mean man, Miles said quickly. He came up in a different era. He spent 40 years in federal courts and he sees what's changed, or what he thinks has changed, and he doesn't always keep those opinions quiet. And he doesn't know what I do, I said. Miles gave a short, guilty exhale. I told him you were a lawyer. I am a lawyer. I told him you worked in law. I looked at him. Miles. I know. He set his cup down. I panicked, okay? The first time I mentioned you to my dad, he asked what you did, and I knew that the second I said federal judge, the whole conversation would become about that. About your decisions, your record, your appointment. About everything except you. And I wanted him to meet you first. I understood the impulse. I didn't entirely agree with it, but I understood it. So he thinks I'm what? He thinks you're an attorney. Private practice, probably. I was vague. I looked at him for a moment. You've been vague for how long? He winced. 8 months. 8 months. I kept meaning to correct it. I picked my coffee back up. And now he's invited us to dinner. Sunday, Connecticut, his house. I thought about it. I had spent 11 years being introduced by my title first and treated as a human being second. The idea of sitting at a table as simply Miles's fiancé, not Judge Harlow, not Your Honor, not the woman whose opinion on the Commerce Clause someone wanted to debate, had a certain appeal that I wasn't going to pretend I didn't feel. All right, I said, I'll come. Miles blinked. Just like that? Just like that. I looked at him. But Miles, if it becomes necessary to say something, I'm going to say it. He nodded immediately. Of course. I won't be anyone's illustration of everything that's wrong with the federal judiciary. Understood. Good. I finished my coffee. What's his name? Arthur. Arthur Calloway. I looked it up that night. Not because I doubted Miles, but because I'm the kind of person who does research before walking into a room. Arthur Calloway had practiced for 41 years. Harvard Law, class of 1976. Federal courts, primarily in the Second Circuit. He'd tried high-profile civil rights cases in the 80s and 90s. He had a reputation as a precise, demanding litigator with strong opinions on judicial restraint. He'd written 2 opinion pieces in the last 4 years arguing that the federal appointment process had become too susceptible to political pressure. One of those pieces had referenced a ruling from my courtroom, not by name, but the case was identifiable. He thought the reasoning was sloppy. I read the piece twice. He was wrong about the reasoning. He was also not entirely wrong about the broader concern. I closed the laptop and went to sleep. The drive to Connecticut took just under 2 hours. It was a gray October Sunday, the kind where the sky stays flat and pale the whole day, and the leaves on the highway medians have gone past gold into rust. Miles drove. He was quieter than usual, which I'd learned meant he was worried. Somewhere past New Haven, I said. Tell me more about him. Miles thought for a moment. He's proud. Not arrogant. Proud. There's a difference with him. Everything he has, he believes he earned. The career, the cases, the reputation. Nobody handed him anything, and he worked hard, and he wants you to know that about him. That's not unusual for his generation. No. Miles glanced at the road. He can be dismissive. Not cruelly. He doesn't mean it the way it lands. But if he's decided you don't have something to contribute to a conversation, he'll make that clear. And you're worried he'll decide that about me before I say 10 words. Miles was quiet for a second. He's going to see a woman in her 30s and assume he knows what kind of lawyer you are. I looked out the window. That's not a new experience for me. I know. Miles exhaled. I just want it to go well. It will, I said. I believed it at the time. I was half right. The Calloway house was in a suburb I'd always found quietly impressive. Old trees, stone walls, houses set back from the road with the kind of settled dignity that takes decades to develop. Arthur Calloway's house was colonial, white with black shutters, a flagstone path to the front door, a garden that had been put to bed for the winter with obvious care. The kind of house that says, someone here takes things seriously. Arthur met us at the door. He was in his early 70s, tall, with the lean posture of a man who had spent decades standing in courtrooms. Silver hair, rimless glasses, a burgundy sweater over a collared shirt. He shook Miles's hand first, then looked at me with sharp, assessing eyes. "Vivian," he said. "Arthur." I extended my hand. "It's a pleasure." His handshake was measured. He was already evaluating. I recognized the habit. I did the same thing at the beginning of every trial. "Come in," he said. Miles's mother, Lena, appeared from the kitchen. She was warm and immediate in a way that made you feel, within 30 seconds, that you were welcome. She hugged Miles, hugged me, asked about the drive, told Arthur the roast would be another 20 minutes, and disappeared back toward the smell of something very good. Arthur led us into the living room. The bookshelves covered 2 full walls, law reviews, case compendiums, biographies of Supreme Court justices, a framed photograph of a younger Arthur standing outside the Second Circuit Courthouse, a glass award from a bar association dated 1994. He saw me looking. "Second Circuit," he said. "Practiced there most of my career." "I know," I said, and then added carefully, "Miles mentioned it." Arthur settled into an armchair. Miles sat on the couch. I sat across from Arthur. The first 20 minutes were pleasant enough. Lena brought out wine. Arthur asked about my background, where I grew up, where I went to school. "Ohio," I told him. "Law school in Virginia." He asked about my practice and I said I'd spent time as a federal prosecutor and then moved into other work, which was accurate enough to be true. Arthur nodded in the way that people do when they filed information into a category and don't plan to revisit it. Then, gradually, the conversation turned to law. It almost always does when lawyers are in a room together. Arthur began with a story about a landmark case he'd tried in 1988. The details were vivid and the legal strategy was genuinely interesting. He told it well. He had earned that story and you could feel it in the way he told it. I asked a few questions that I hoped came across as natural. They did, I think, though I noticed once or twice that my questions landed with more precision than he expected from someone he'd already decided was a mid-level associate somewhere. By the time Lena called us to the table, Arthur had begun talking about the federal bench. It started as observation. The Second Circuit had changed, he said. More judges from academic backgrounds than trial backgrounds. The shift showed in the opinions. Theoretically rigorous, practically thin. Miles passed the bread. Lena asked whether I wanted more wine. Arthur continued. He wasn't wrong about everything. The tension between academic appointments and practitioners on the bench is real and worth discussing, but he was already shaping the conversation around a conclusion he'd arrived at before dinner started. Then, halfway through the roast, he turned toward me. "Vivian," he said, "you worked in federal court." "Prosecution side," Miles said. "That's right," he nodded. "Then you've seen it. The bench today isn't what it was 20 years ago." I took a small bite of food. "In what ways?" He seemed pleased by the question. "Experience, mainly. Judges who've never stood on the trial side of a courtroom making decisions about trial procedure." He shook his head. "Or appointments that are made for reasons that have nothing to do with judicial temperament." Miles looked at his plate. "What qualities do you think matter most?" I asked. Arthur set his fork down. "Judgment," he said. "The real kind. Not the kind you develop writing papers, the kind you develop sitting in a courtroom for 20 years watching how cases actually move, watching what happens to real people when legal theory meets the real world. That does matter," I said. "It does." He picked up his fork again. "The problem is the appointments process doesn't always reward that. You get nominees with thin records, put forward because of who they know or what they represent politically, and those people end up making decisions that affect millions of people." He paused. "It's not personal. It's structural. The system has a problem." Lena quietly redirected. "Arthur, I think the roast is—" "I'm just making a point," Arthur said, gently but firmly. He turned back to me. "You've been in federal court. You've seen it from the prosecution side. You've stood in front of judges who didn't fully understand what you were dealing with. Hasn't that been your experience?" I looked at him. This was the moment I'd known was coming since the drive up from the city. I set my fork down and folded my hands on the table. And I said, in the same tone I use when I'm about to explain something significant to a courtroom, "Arthur, I do understand the concern. Judicial experience matters enormously." He nodded. It shaped a lot of my own thinking on the bench. Arthur blinked. Just once. The table went quiet. Lena put her wine glass down very slowly. Miles became very still beside me. Arthur looked at me across the dinner table. "I'm sorry? I've been on the federal district court bench for 11 years, I said. "I was appointed at 34. I know that was young, and I know there are opinions about that." Arthur didn't move. "I believe I've read at least one of yours," I added. The color changed in Arthur Calloway's face. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but the way it does when a very certain person suddenly realizes they've been standing on ground that was different than they thought. Miles let out a quiet breath. Lena looked between the two of us with the composed patience of a woman who had watched her husband be surprised by very few things in 40 years of marriage and had just watched him be surprised by something entirely new. Arthur said, carefully, "You're a federal judge." "Yes." "District court." "Yes." A long pause. "Which district?" I told him. Something shifted behind his eyes. He was running through his memory the way lawyers do. Cases, decisions, names attached to rulings he'd read or cited or argued about. I watched the moment of recognition cross his face. "The Meridian case," he said slowly. "Yes." He had cited that ruling in one of his op-eds. He had not cited it favorably. Arthur sat back in his chair. He took off his glasses, held them for a moment, and put them back on. Then he looked at Miles. Miles met his father's gaze and said nothing. Arthur looked at me again. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" "I wanted to meet you as Miles's fiancé," I said, "not as a title." The silence that followed was different from the silences earlier in the evening. Those had been pauses in conversation. This was something settling. An entire evening reconfiguring itself under a new weight. Lena spoke first. "Well," she said quietly with careful warmth, "I think perhaps the roast deserves another round." Arthur said nothing. He was still looking at me, but the certainty that had shaked every sentence he'd spoken for the last hour was gone, and in its place was something more complicated. The particular discomfort of a man who has spent 40 years being the sharpest person in the room about a subject and has just realized that the person sitting across from him may know things he doesn't. The rest of dinner was quieter. Arthur asked a few careful questions. Not the probing, testing questions from before, careful ones. What were the most challenging aspects of the role? How had I thought about the tension between judicial restraint and evolving legal standards? I answered honestly. He listened in a way he hadn't before dinner. Miles ate in the careful silence of someone who has been holding his breath for 2 hours and has not yet been given permission to exhale. After dessert, Lena announced she needed help in the kitchen and extracted Miles with the kind of efficiency that made clear she was giving her husband and me a moment alone. Arthur and I sat at the table. He turned his wine glass slowly in his hands. Then he said, "I owe you an apology. You don't need." "Yes, I do." He looked up. "I've spent 40 years telling young lawyers to never assume they know more than the person across from them until they've heard them out." He paused. "Tonight I did exactly that." I said nothing. "I heard lawyer and decided what kind of lawyer," he said. "I heard your age and decided what kind of experience." He shook his head. "I wrote an op-ed questioning your judgment on Meridian without once considering that you might know something I didn't. You weren't entirely wrong about the concerns," I said. He looked surprised. "Which part?" "The structural pressure on appointments. It's real. It's something I think about." I met his eyes. "Disagreeing with my reasoning in Meridian is legitimate. The reasoning held up on appeal, but the underlying tension you identified was worth raising." Arthur studied me for a moment, then something in his face relaxed. Not fully, but enough to show that the man beneath the certainty was still capable of reconsidering. "You read it," he said. "The night before I came to dinner." He gave a quiet exhale that might have been a laugh. "Of course you did." He called me 4 days later. My clerk put through the call with a slightly puzzled expression. "An Arthur Calloway judge. He says it's personal." I thanked her and picked up, and on the other end of the line was a man whose voice had none of the authority from Sunday dinner. What it had instead was something more careful. "Vivian," he said, "I won't keep you long. I was wondering if you'd be willing to have coffee." I agreed, and we met at a small place in the city the following Tuesday, neutral ground, away from courtrooms and dinner tables and 40 years of accumulated positions. Arthur was already there when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me, which I suspected was not something he did for everyone. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, and for the first minute neither of us spoke. Then Arthur said, "I've been thinking about Sunday since Sunday." I imagined so. He looked down at his cup. "I want to ask you something directly. All right? Did you know, going into dinner, what I'd written? What I thought about your decisions?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And you came anyway." "Miles asked me to." "That's not entirely why." He was right. It wasn't entirely why. I looked at him. "I wanted to meet you as a person before we had to be anything else to each other." Arthur considered that. "And what did you find?" I thought about it honestly. "A man who loves the law the same way I do, who's worried that something worth caring about is being eroded, and who expresses that worry loudly when he probably should sometimes express it more quietly." Arthur gave a small, rueful smile. "That's generous. It's accurate." He turned his cup in his hands. "You know what embarrasses me most about Sunday?" "What?" "Not that I was wrong about your experience. Not even that I argued against your reasoning in print before I'd sat across from you." He paused. "What embarrasses me is that I spent 40 years fighting for rooms where people like you should have always had a seat, and the moment you sat down across from me, I almost didn't see you clearly." The honesty in that landed differently than I expected. I said, "What made you see it differently?" Arthur thought for a moment. "The Meridian comment," he said. "When you told me I wasn't entirely wrong." He looked up. "A lesser person would have used that dinner to make me feel small. You didn't. That wasn't what the dinner was for." "No," he said. "It was a family dinner." And I turned it into a lecture. I said, "You were defending something you believed in." "I was assuming," he said. "There's a difference." We sat with that for a moment. Then Arthur said, "I'd like to start over, if you're willing." I looked at him across the table. This careful, proud, sharp-minded man who had spent 4 decades in the rooms I now occupied, who had gotten something significantly wrong about me and knew it, and was asking for the chance to correct it. "I'm willing," I said. He exhaled. "Good." He picked up his coffee cup. "Because Miles is going to marry you with or without my blessing, and I'd rather give it." I smiled. "That's wise." "I've had moments of wisdom," he said dryly. "Occasionally." We went back to the Connecticut house the following Sunday. Same streets, same stone path, same garden put to bed for winter. But when Arthur opened the door this time, he stepped forward immediately. No assessment. No pause. "Vivian," he said, and extended his hand before I could reach for it first. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Lena had made the same meal. When I mentioned it, she smiled and said, "Same table, new memory, that's the idea." Arthur laughed quietly, genuinely, and I realized I hadn't heard him laugh the first time. Dinner was different. Arthur asked about the caseload, about the cases that stayed with him, about the parts of the role that were harder than people imagined from the outside. I told him. He listened. Every so often he pushed back on something, not dismissively, but the way people do when they're engaged. It was the conversation I'd hoped Sunday dinner would be. At one point he said, "Can I ask about Meridian? Not to argue. I want to understand the reasoning better." "Yes," I said. "We talked through it for 20 minutes. He didn't change his view entirely. I didn't need him to, but by the end of it, he said, 'I see what you were doing,' and meant it, and that was worth more than agreement." After dinner, Miles and I walked to the car while Arthur and Lena stood on the porch. Miles was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think that went well." "It did. He likes you." I looked back at the house. Arthur raised a hand from the porch, a simple, restrained gesture. I raised mine in return. "He respects me," I said. which from him is probably more important. Miles thought about that. Yeah, he said, it probably is. We drove back through the October dark, the highway pale and quiet, and I thought about all the moments in the last 11 years when I'd walked into a room and been underestimated, in small ways and large ones, by people who meant harm, and by people who simply hadn't looked carefully enough. Most of those moments I'd let pass without comment, not because they didn't matter, but because I'd learned something about how change actually happens. It doesn't happen when you make someone feel small. It happens when you give them a clear enough picture of the truth that they have no choice but to see it themselves. Arthur Calloway had spent 40 years believing the law was a serious thing that deserved serious people. He wasn't wrong. He just needed to revise what serious people could look like. And sometimes that revision takes one quiet dinner to begin. I've thought about that dinner a lot since it happened, not with bitterness. I want to be clear about that. More the way you turn something over in your hands when it surprises you, when it turns out to hold more weight than it first appeared to. Arthur Calloway spent 40 years in federal courtrooms. He earned every opinion he carried into that dining room, and yet, across a plate of roast chicken on a Sunday evening in Connecticut, he decided, within 20 minutes, exactly who I was and what I understood. He didn't do it cruelly. That almost made it harder in a way. Cruelty is easier to dismiss. What Arthur did was something most of us do without realizing it. He looked at the surface and stopped there. What I've learned, not from any single lesson, but from 11 years of sitting on a bench and watching what people do under pressure, is that assumptions are almost never neutral. They always cost someone something. In Arthur's case that evening, what his assumptions cost him was the chance to have a real conversation with someone who loved the same thing he loved, the law, the weight of it, what it demands from the people who practice it. He spent an hour lecturing a room he could have spent that same hour genuinely talking to. But here's what I keep coming back to. Arthur could have doubled down. When I told him who I was, he could have been defensive. He could have explained away the lecture, repositioned it, made it mean something other than what it was. A lot of people would have. Instead, he sat with the discomfort. He let himself be embarrassed, and 4 days later he called and asked to meet, not to repair his image, but to actually reckon with what he'd done. That took something. Real intelligence isn't knowing the most. It's being willing to update what you know. Real character isn't never getting something wrong. It's what you do the moment you realize you have. Arthur had both of those things underneath the pride, and the pride, I think, had just been sitting on top of them for a long time. Miles asked me, on the drive home after that second dinner, whether I thought his father had really changed, or whether he was just managing the situation. I told him I thought the question itself was the wrong frame. People don't change in one evening. What happens in one evening is that something cracks open. Some old certainty gets a little light in it, and then the question is, what the person does with that opening over time. Arthur was still going to have his opinions. He was still going to push back on legal reasoning he disagreed with, but now he'd do it across the table from someone he'd actually looked at, someone he'd chosen to see clearly. That's not a small thing. I came to that dinner as Miles's fiancé. I left as something more complicated, a person Arthur had underestimated and then had to reckon with, which, in the end, is the only way some people ever truly see you. Not because you insisted, not because you forced the moment, but because you stayed steady long enough for the truth to do its own work. That's the only revenge I've ever been interested in. The quiet kind. The kind that leaves the other person with something to think about instead of someone to resent.